I don't know if you had a chance to look at like these are just like my broad thoughts, but you really don't need to know them. So are we unmuted? Oh, right. I told you. No, okay. Noah.
Okay, I think we'll get started, and then if people arrive a bit late, then we'll just let them get on with the program. So, hi everyone, and to our fellow panelists and participants online, welcome. We're very happy to have you today for this event, which we're organizing for in observance of Ida Hot this year. This is a joint event that we've put together between the Center for Human Rights of the University of Victoria, the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, also University of Victoria, the French Alliance in Victoria, the Embassy of Switzerland, and the Embassy of France. So it's quite, and I hope I didn't forget anyone. So yeah, it's a joint event that we're very pleased to have you attending. And our idea was to address the question of language in relation to sexuality, so sexual orientation and gender identity. So my name is Noël Garcin. I'm with the Embassy of France, and I will just I'm not going to be the program director, but I'm just going to open the event and maybe give you a bit of context of why we chose this topic, and introduce you with the program, and then I'll leave the floor to my colleague Fanny from the Embassy of Switzerland to say a few words as well before we really dive into the topic. So just to give you just a quick running order, we'll first have an overview presentation by Dr. Julie Abou, who is currently in Canada. So it's morning time for her, and she will give us an overview of why is this relevant when we talk about why is language relevant when we consider issues around sexual orientation and gender identities. And then we'll have a panel discussion moderated by Taruna and Sohela. And after that, we'll be very happy to have a conversation with participants, so both in the room and online participants. As you can see, it's a very hybrid event, to the point that all our panelists are online and our moderators are in person with us. So we'll try to make it as flowing as possible. But yeah, this is COVID era kind of event. So thanks so much for attending. Just a few words on why this topic. Language is a very powerful force, which is integral to how we relate to others and how we express ideas and our views on the world and how we shape the world, in fact. So it's really not surprising that in contemporary debates on the LGBTQI+ rights and identity, the debate often centers on language and the use of pronouns, terminology, reclamation of slurs, appropriation of slang, and even how we interpret legislation. So we thought, with the panel discussion, it would be very interesting to explore how language may liberate or evolve or empower and even sometimes repress queer people. And we wanted to have a range of panelists that could give us some insights on different languages. So we have people from French-speaking background. We've got South Africans, so I think there was some Xhosa. I'm not sure which other language group we'll have here. And I think Zinhle is a student in Spanish, so she will also offer a perspective on Spanish language and how the language integrates or doesn't integrate aspects of gender neutrality and inclusivity. So the discussion will very much center on recognizing how these languages make space for LGBTQI plus identities. And also would like the panelists to explore a little bit opportunities to implement the use of inclusive language and ideas of diversity. So this is basically what we're going to cover in the conversation. And next to this panel, we organized a very small exhibition that also illustrates some of the topics that we'll be covering today. So feel free to have a look after the discussion is over. I won't say much more. I've already taken too much time. I will leave the floor to Fanny, and after that, I think we can jump right in with Julie from Canada to give us the keynote presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noel. Hello, everybody. Welcome, dear participants, tonight to this panel discussion today. I have the pleasure to welcome you in the name of the Swiss Embassy. My name is Fanny Charnet, and I am the political advisor of the embassy. So, as Noel said, we are part of the long list of sponsors of this event, and we wanted to be part of it because 2 days ago, on the 17th of May, as you probably all know, we celebrated the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. And today, we wanted really to pay tribute to this important international day. That should be actually a day of solidarity, to show respect, to show great living together. But unfortunately, it is also here to remind us that it is also a synonym of great discrimination that occur every day on gender, on the gender definition, and on our own perception of what gender is. We were actually quite attracted by the topic of today that focus on languages, on linguistics. I'm a master of linguistics myself. I have a diploma in this regard, and I found always during my studies that it was one of the fields that should be more discussed and more discussed upon. Because if you look at the general international debate on homophobia, it's really very much focused on rights, of course, on equality. I'm not here, of course, to remind you of the precursor role that South Africa played in the continent on that regard. A truly amazing role, in fact, because if I take the example of my own country, of Switzerland, I mean, we are on a very mediocre place when it comes to equality of rights. Only 2 years ago, in 2020, we finally passed a law to ensure that homophobia speech and actions can be penalized by our criminal law, penal law, sorry. So it is actually quite recent that these steps are taking place in my own country. And we are actually also quite proud that in 2 months from now, on the 1st of July, finally, same-sex marriage will be a reality in our country. But we still have a long way to go, especially when we see the example that we have here. Therefore, we wanted to also to see this whole debate with a new lens, with a new angle, and that's why we are here today, and we wanted to invite you all for this panel. We are proposing you a new journey, a reflection on languages. That is, of course, a communication tool that we all use on a daily basis, and we would like to reflect on how it is shifting our vision of gender, our vision of what is our identity. We will have an interesting panel of experts that will have a look at language from a linguistic point of view, of the communication point of view. And as Noel just said earlier, we also have an interesting exhibition outside that will focus on the visual aspect of language. And on that regard, it is also our pleasure to see that this exhibition will show the work of a Swiss graphic designer, Tristan Bartoloni. And he actually created an inclusive alphabet, how to write language from an inclusive point of view. So you will have the possibility after this panel to discover his work, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you and to reflect on this panel that we have today. Thank you very much and enjoy the discussion. I will give the floor to Julie to step up into the discussion.
Hi, and greetings from Montreal, and thank you for this invitation. I'm really glad to be here, to be virtually here. In this talk, I choose to focus on the political dimension of language and about language at the site of struggle for gender and sexuality, and the communication will be a kind of toolbox. So I just share my slides, if it works, yeah. Here, and just in case I forgot the slide or it's frozen, just shout at me and I'll try to do something. Okay, so the matter of denomination is crucial in all social and political struggle. Butler explains why. So she said, one of the forms of social suffering for sexual minorities is the recognition of not being recognized. But the search for an appropriate language, the emphasis on the subject in the first person, and the narrative of one's own experience are ways to overcome this lack of recognition. So self-denomination, self-qualification are primary steps in becoming a subject. But to what extent a subject should be a political subject? Because of the heterosexist structure, diverging from the sexual norms cannot be but political. Not recognizing it is a privilege of dominance and central positions. So the matter of language, and here I'm quoting Monique Wittig, is an important political field where power is at stake, unceasingly acting on social reality. To make oneself intelligible requires to speak as a political subject. Queer people use a political identity as a resistance to social assignation. But how does it work? Well, we can think of language as an environment like air for terrestrials or water for fishes. Language surrounds us. Language is our only way to access reality. The linguist Benveniste even wrote, I'm quoting him, for the speaker, there is a complete equivalence between language and reality. The sign overlies and commands reality. Even better, it is reality. Speech taboos, he gives example like speech taboos, the magic power of the word, we can add blasphemy. So what we call in linguistics the arbitrary structure of language is in a way just a methodological artifact for linguists, but of no use to understand why, for example, a word is a taboo, or why, what is the truth, what is a likelihood, what is a lie, why a word hurts, or why a word paves the way for existence. Even Saussure, the founder of linguistics, told it, language is radically powerless to defend itself against the forces which from one moment to the next are shifting the signs. And these forces, of course, are of social nature. So the feminist linguist Debbie Cameron reports a quite old experience. So I hope Pascal won't shout at me because it's quite old, but I think it's still working, where pairs of nouns were presented to English speakers, and these speakers were asked to give a masculine and a feminine status to each of them. So we can do the test now. So if I give you the pair fork and knife, and you have to attribute a masculine and a feminine to fork and knife, well, I can guess most of you will say that the knife.
Sorry, Julie, there's been an interruption in the transmission. Can you please pause for a second until we can get you back up for the viewers in the physical room? All right. Sorry for the interruption. We'll be back online very soon. So in the meantime, I think maybe for those of you, like, we have been struggling to hear some of what Judy has been saying, but she has been speaking about how language is an environment. So it kind of creates the ways that you interact with power dynamics and different identities. And she was now speaking about the struggle for denomination and looking at why are certain words taboo, whereas language is perceived to be this very fixed thing that can never change, but we know through history and art that over the years, things can have completely opposite meanings to what they once originated as. So
that brings you up to speed.
Is it just the video or the sounds as well? The sound as well?
Oh, we saw. So when we were conceptualizing this panel, a quote that really informed the direction we took was this by Gina Cadleck, who, on the topic of queer literature, writes, "A history of queer language is a history of queer people. It marks how we understood ourselves, how we were understood by institutions, how we wrote and rewrote ourselves, how we and absorbed and reconfigured words to suit what we needed." So that really is the overarching theme of today's discussion, this idea that language is an integral part of all of our lives and therefore an integral part of queerness, whether from the outside as a tool of repression and exclusion, or from the inside as a tool that we have used to pursue liberation, to affirm our identities and tell our own stories. And that's what the panelists are going to discuss from all of their really unique perspectives. But while we wait, with anyone who perhaps had a story to share or an experience to recount of ways in which language has maybe shaped or sexuality, language play this active role in the world around you. Does anyone want to be brave for us? Yes, thank you.
For me, I understood this is so we are pronoun agnostic. I mean, and then once I understood this, literally everything that very carefully. And even when I started working in the space of rights, even just adjusting my mind to pronouns was a process because my language doesn't say those things. Yeah, very interesting I'm curious to hear the story that you shared today about how language, our work, our experience, rights, and our stories.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really important point of how I know in English discourse, there's this idea that pronouns, or this idea from a certain segment of people that pronouns are this fixed thing. How can you demand gender neutral pronouns? How can you ask to be referred to by these pronouns? And there's little acknowledgement that across different cultures and different people, sometimes pronouns just don't matter at all. Sometimes they matter even for inanimate objects. And I think existing in that space of fluidity allows us to think even more deeply about the debates in the English language or French or Isizulu. I think we had another hand. Sure. Can you hear us online?
Oui.
All right, excellent. Then I think our audio troubles have been fixed. So Dr. Julie, I think you are free to continue.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for the interruption. So I was about to propose you a little experiment about, well, it was an experiment done with English speakers. And so the experiment is as goes. If I give you the pair, the couple, fork and knife, and if I ask you to choose which one is masculine and which one is feminine, well, You can do it now, and we would be surprised to see that most of the people we choose that knife is masculine and fork feminine. But then if we take the pair fork and spoon, maybe the fork will become masculine and the spoon become feminine. What about vanilla and chocolate? We see we can also project this binary of masculine and feminine, masculinity, femininity on these pairs. And last example is salt and pepper. And same, I guess most of the people will choose pepper as a masculine and salt as the feminine. So of course, there is no masculinity in pepper, but which is surprising is that a language with no grammatical gender, in this kind of language, still speakers can attribute such a gendered meaning to those nouns. It is because of what we can call the linguistic imaginary or the metaphorical force of language. That means we have symbolic structures on our mind and we project it where we can. So grammatical gender never precedes social categorization. First comes the social distinction. So first it's a matter of social, and then there is a grammaticalization in some language. And last, there is an ideological operation led by grammarians to make it sound natural. So grammatical gender is everything but referring to nature or sex. But there are a bunch of grammarians who keep trying to impose on language the ideological views about what men and women should be and what language should be according to this idea about men and women. So that's the case for Protagoras, that's the case for Vaugelas, that's the case for a lot of grammarians in the history. And while other speakers propose new forms carrying another and a more emancipatory view about the social world. Therefore, there is no language which is more sexist than another. Grammar is just one of the places where the gender structure could take place and could be materialized. We can imagine gender as a liquid, like going in different places, and grammar is one of these places. So gendered and genderless languages can equally reinforce gender order by making minority overspecified or invisible. But they can also equally challenge it through different strategies, neutralization or neologism towards linguistic disturbance or normalization of new practices. So it's really a matter of political strategy. Sorry, I forgot the slides. These strategies are related to what Cameron calls verbal hygiene. So verbal hygienes are discourses in which people try, or maybe I put, which people try to clean up language and make it conform to their ideals of beauty, truth, efficiency, logic, correctness, or civility. Why it is so? Because to touch the language is always to touch something more. Our linguistic concerns merge with non-linguistic concerns. They constitute and express positions which are revealed on the occasion of social changes, social, moral, political questions that forge a certain regime of truth. I will take an example, the French polemic about inclusive writing. It's a really good example of verbal hygiene. Linguistic and nationalist identities are often narrowly interrelated. In France, this really strong association between language and nation, this what I call a language nation yoking, is made in the name of republic. So it's a kind of linguistic republicanism materialized, among other things, through legislative and constitutional measures. In addition, there is a lot of works about gender and post-colonialism that have shown how colonial order, nationalist order, sexual order, and gender order lean against each other. So French republicanism is therefore also claiming a certain order of gender, a certain vision of what gender should be related to nation. This is what I call the gender nation yoking. And these two yokings create then a third one, a gender language nation yoking. That's why the French government reacts strongly about the issue of the denomination of women and actually of other non-male people. Right-wing philosopher Robert Redeker makes the point even clearer when he writes, inclusive writing seeks to make invisible what language makes visible, the nation. So I think that's clear. Linguistic ideologies and gender ideologies are so interwoven that touching linguistic gender means touching the nation. That's the conservative version of this yoking. There is also a liberal version of this yoking, but I won't have time to speak of it now. So the ideology of linguistic purism or the fantasy of a previous state of language to be back are verbal hygiene. Conversely, Borba and Carvalho, two Brazilian scholars, provocatively conceive that queer and feminist innovations in language are verbal filth. So it's a kind of stigma reversal. Conservative and hygienists perceive these innovations as a source of chaos to be eradicated in order to keep language and society clean, sterilized, both linguistically and politically. So choose verbal filth as a strategy could be something we can do. So we have seen how ideology shaped language. Now let's focus on discourse to see how languages produces gender and sexuality. Sorry. So just a couple of examples. So I put the French version in gray, but there is a translation, English translation in black. The living tends only to reproduce. So it's example from scientific books. So it must at all costs conquer the female in order to reproduce. Another example, the whole village left the next day. This is Lévi-Strauss, which is a French anthropologist, leaving us alone with the women and the children in the abandoned houses. A last example, which is a humoristic one, but still it's working because of just the same process. Man is unique among the apes in that he grows a long beard, and it is to this that he owes his superior intelligence. So there is a voluntary confusion between the species and gender. So here it's not a matter of grammar, it's not a matter of linguistic structure, but of discourse. Behind a word lies a world, a set of values, tenses, worldviews. Theater director Peter Brook said, the world, maybe I have a slide for this? No, sorry. The world is a small visible portion of a gigantic unseen formation. Even more, we can say that each word can be a site of struggle. According to Voloshinov, in any ideological sign, and now I think I have the slide, in any ideological sign, contradictory indexes of value are clashing. Every living ideological sign has two faces. Any living criticism can become praise. Any truth cannot fail to appear to some the greatest of lies. A timely example of it is the current discourses about abortion, especially in the US. Opposing two discourses around one word, abortion is a right and abortion is a crime. And we know that a right cannot be a crime. So these antagonist qualifications reveal the political dimension of the word. Through his conception of what he called dialogism, Voloshinov invites us to think any speech act as an historical event, in the sense that it takes place in a given socio-historical context. It replies to previous speeches. It will trigger future speeches, reactions. We use language to take a stance in a huge discussion beyond the specific interaction we are engaged in. So speaking, for example, today at this International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia in Pretoria, echoes all the other events taking place elsewhere, but also the previous years in other cities, countries, languages, and also the future events that will happen. Also, it replies to the homophobic, transphobic, and biphobic discourses, which are countered, and also all the authors I make speaking in this communication, etc. So this is uninterrupted communication continuum. In this continuum lied what we can call discursive formations. A discursive formation are the sets in which the words make sense and are articulated to each other. So discursive formation determine what can be said and has to be said from a specific position. So it's not about the nature of words, it's about the construction within words, within which words combine. It's about who is speaking and how it gives sense, meaning to this word. This combination determines the meanings of words It is everything that is neither universal nor purely individual. It is related to conflictual positions. So we are always talking and living in a regime with different norms coexisting. These norms are structured, for example, through heteronormativity, but there are always breaches in these structures. They are always incompletely structured, and this is why there is room for emancipation. And in the following, I'll just discuss some examples of discursive formation about sexuality. So the matter of silence has been at the core of AIDS fighting activism. But working on silence is silence is a really important matter in this struggle, but working on the silence is very difficult. How to work on the absence, and what does this absence mean? That's all the difficulty of queer archive practices torn between building historical continuity and denouncing the erasure of non-normative subjects. Jonathan Nedcat, a historian of sexuality, also argued that silence is the implicit of domination. And for that reason, we should do the history of heterosexuality. He says, it is particularly unsettling, I think, to speak of heterosexual history, for that history challenges our usual implicit deterministic assumption that heterosexuality is fixed, timeless, biological, synonymous with the conjunction of female and male organs and acts. To the contrary, I argue heterosexuality, like homosexuality, has an unheralded various past and an open, undetermined future. To paraphrase Karl Marx, women and men make their own sexual and affectional history, but they do not make it this history just as they please. They make it under circumstances given by the past and altered by their political activity and organization and their vision of a valued future. But silence is also taboo and prohibition. In a chapter, my second example, in a chapter of excitable speech, Butler puts under scrutiny the don't tell, don't ask of the US Army. You know that measure. She said, the term homosexual is not banned, but it is forbidden to use it as a self-definition. So the paradox is the following. There are conditions in which the term homosexual should not be claimed, but these conditions are related to the status of the person as homosexual. It is forbidden to use the term homosexual only if you're homosexual. So it's not a mere censorship, since the term is in use, but it's a will to keep control on its meaning. The goal is to ban self-definition. Insults and other designation of others are not concerned by this measure. This is a legal level of silence organization. Moreover, this rule implied that what makes you homosexual is not a practice, any kind of practice, but it is self-designation. I'm quoting Butler again. The words I am a homosexual would not be a mere description. They are meant to accomplish what they describe, not only in the sense that they make the speaker homosexual, but also in the sense that they make the speech a homosexual conduct. That's the main point here, I guess, in her demonstration. Another example in French, this time of legal organization of linguistic homophobia with a Labour court case. In 2015, a hairdresser mistakenly received a text from his boss saying, I'm not keeping this hairdresser. I don't like this guy, he's a faggot. And then this guy was fired. So he brings a case to the court, but was dismissed. And here what the court stated. In the context of the hairdressing industry, the council considers that the term faggot used by the manager cannot be considered homophobic, as it is recognized that hairdressing salons regularly employ homosexuals without causing any problems. Okay, that's mad. Here, the judgment pretends that faggot and homosexual are synonyms, erasing the linguistic wound of the slur to understand it as a mere descriptive label. This is a vision of language as transparent, where language is a set of labels more or less adjusted to pre-existing objects in the world. As we have seen, language is anything but transparent. And advocating for that transparency, thinking of language as transparent, is a way to maintain the social order, the status quo. Similarly to verbal hygiene and linguistic turmoil, which are arguments in a debate between conservative and emancipatory views of language, the transparency of language is related to ideological views about nature. More, an ideology is essentialist, that is based on the idea of a pre-existing nature as human nature or as physiological arrangements or as a divine nature. So more it's essentialist, more it will consider language as transparent, with the idea of pre-linguistic truth lying in the object of the world. That's the case of masculinist discourses, homophobic discourses, but also transhumanist discourses. Conversely, more an ideology refuses the theological idea of nature, more it is subject to invest language as a site of struggle, as it is the case with queer, feminist, or anarchist ideologies. These are cultures of discourse, refusing the idea of an historical social order based on nature and supporting the idea that language is a crucial tool for change because language shapes our relations to the world. So I wanted to present several other examples, backing up this idea that sexuality is mainly built through language and mainly a matter of language. I was, among others, thinking of an excerpt of Tony Kushner as Angels in America. So I just put it on the screen, but I guess we don't have time for commenting it, but maybe you can read it if it's big enough. So it's a theater play about the beginning of AIDS in the gay New York of the 80s. And the character here is Roy Cohn. It's a powerful US prosecutor who existed for real. And he discusses with his doctor, who tries to tell him he contracted AIDS. And actually he refused. He said, no, I don't have AIDS because AIDS is for homosexual. Homosexuals are not men who sleep with other men. Homosexuals are men who in 15 years of trying cannot get a peace and discrimination bill, etc. So he has a really a reading of sexuality in general as a matter of power in first place. Okay, I briefly conclude about the possibilities of emancipation offered by language. So we have seen how language is a primary site of subjectivity and how it is our access to reality. We have seen that grammatical categories are sensitive to socio-historical contexts and ideological pressures. This can be a place for binary sedimentation, but also a place for linguistic disturbance and experimentation. More broadly, linguistic innovations are juggling the gender language nation yoking and verbal hygienism. But they also could turn, we have to be careful because linguistic innovation could also turn into a new verbal hygiene or in the business of subversion, as Butler says, especially within the commodity culture where subversion carries market value. In the second part of the communication, I have focused on the discursive formation of sexuality to understand how sexuality occurs in discourse, how homosexuality as well as heterosexuality are foremost discursive conduct, which is related to our construction as subjects. The heteronormative formation can resort to silence, but also to a view of language as transparent, as a trick to naturalize categories. And it's only when one looks at the breach of the formation that it reveals itself as an ideological structure. However, I'm lost in the slide. Yeah. However, structures are always incomplete. And that's the good news. Because they are historical, there is room for change. In linguistics, we speak of the simultaneous mutability and immutability of the sign. So what that means, mutability because it is always open to change, it could move. And immutability because we need a minimal fixation of meaning in order for the words to be mutually understandable, to be shared. So this fixation comes from the repeatable character of language. It's not only because we say something that this thing comes to existence. So it's not the magic power of language. It is because a large number of people repeat it a large number of times that discourses become social realities. Hence, the importance of collective self-denomination as a grip on the world. And to do so, we have to navigate between mutability and immutability. We need, on one hand, to set and adjust new tools of the representations to make them stable enough to be largely shared, to travel. On the other hand, we need to maintain the political power of queer irruption. We need also, and third aspect that Borba and Carvalho remind, to break the inherited logic in which deviations from the norm are tolerated or even encouraged when produced by the elites, like conceptual innovation or creative genius, etc., but punished when produced by individuals without linguistic prestige. Like it is then mistakes, accusation of incomprehension for learners, for the poor, etc. We need to not stop talking. We need to keep talking, to always keep looking towards new direction, new ways of telling the world. And I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julie. We really appreciate how in-depth you went in your presentation to try and give us different perspectives to how linguistic cultures are formed, how they are controlled, and how we can push back against them before they cause further harms to vulnerable communities. So I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists who are with us today. So I'll start in the order that I have everyone's bios. So I'm going to do first names only. I hope that's okay. So the first panelist is Zinche. She is a 21-year-old student who has a bachelor's degree in political sciences, and she is currently completing her honors degree in Spanish. And her mini thesis is on the strides made towards inclusive language in regards to Spanish. So I think that introduces one of the linguistic cultures that we will be touching on today. Our second panelist is Landa, who is an educator, writer, speaker, and intersectional scholar. Landa is a PhD candidate in public health at the University of Cape Town, and his research focuses on access to inclusive therapies for trans and gender diverse demographics at public universities on campus, in the health facilities on campus. Landa is also a trans educationalist through his independent consultancy and is the author of Becoming Him, a trans memoir of triumph. He is the first known transgender man in South Africa to successfully motivate a medical aid to pay for his gender affirming surgeries, which is really a big thing, you know, because these procedures are so expensive and you have to follow up with gender affirming healthcare, you know, pre-op, post-op, and there are other forms of gender affirming healthcare services that you commit to. And also lectures at the University of Western Cape on transgender identities, as well as the Stellenbosch University as part of the Quality Unit's Global Education Program. Our next panelist is Dr. Sakhilem Suli, who we don't see on screen at the moment, but will be joining us on video during the course of the discussion. Sakhile holds a doctoral degree in psychology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is a registered clinical psychologist and trained for his clinical masters at the Nelson Mandela University. He started working in the area of gender, sexuality, and sexual health as a research psychologist at the Human Sciences Research Council. And he is the founding and board member for the Professional Association for Transgender Health South Africa. He has also done some work in gender affirming healthcare for trans persons with WITS RHI and the East London Trans Clinic, and he provides mental health care services to persons in the LGBTQIA+ community. Yes, And then next we have Dr. Pascal, who heads the team of psycholinguistics and applied social psychology at the University of Freiburg. His work focuses on how our brain processes male grammatical features. So Pascal regularly speaks in the media on the topics of inclusive language, feminization of language, and linguistic sexism. With his colleagues Sandrine Zefferet and Ut Gavel, he has published a book with a French title, which I will not butcher, but the English translation of this title is Does Our Brain Think in the Male Form? Brain, Language, and Sexist Representations. And I think our panelists today have a wide range of experience when it comes to language, linguistic cultures, as well as how language is sexed and how that then filters into queer identities. So I'll hand it over to Sakhilem.
Thank you, Taruna. I think something really interesting that our keynote speech addressed was this idea of language, not just as a neutral conduit of ideas, or even as we've been discussing it as a sort of independent force for various things, but as a reflection of existing social structures, ideologies, and politics. While she was speaking, a language that immediately popped into my head was French, which I don't know very well, but when I began learning, one of the things that stuck out to me was just how incredibly gendered the language is, to the point where even inanimate objects have a gender. So to start off our conversation, Dr. Pascal, can you tell us a little bit, given your expertise in linguistic sexism and the ways our brains work around language, how language, in your view, and maybe in particular French, enforce societal and ideological binaries, gender, sexuality, etc.?
Okay, this is a vast question. Thanks for inviting me anyway, and it was really nice to hear Julia Abou as well. The one thing we need to remember, and this comes mostly from psychology and from philosophy as well, it's that language has a limited set of options to talk about the illimited world. And in that sense, the way we perceive this impact here is to think of language as attracting our attention towards some properties of the world that are not necessarily relevant. So in that sense, because language has a limited set of options, it constrains the way we see the world. And now if we go to French, for example, because it's so gendered. So the first thing, yeah, it is gendered, but also it is very masculine. The masculine form has been this default value that has been, this overarching value. And in that sense, it offers a world where we think the world with men, actually, which is wrong, which is not the reality. So this is how we can perceive this link between language and thought, and this is how we perceive it as psychologists. This idea that it's an attentional tool where we tend to be attracted towards some wrong properties of the world, in a sense that we've been biased. And French is a particularly bad language because it keeps expressing binary gender. And in that sense, it keeps us thinking of the world in terms of binary. And in that sense, it's a particularly biasing language, that's for sure. But there are other languages like that. And there are about 90 languages that you could say that have this biasing, attentional drift towards binary gender.
I wonder if you have some maybe concrete examples of the way in which language might do that, or French might actually enforce those binaries.
So, I mean, for the moment, if you think about French, and you think about, we work mostly on human reference. And if you think about human referencing in French at the moment, there are very little options to actually talk about other human reference than masculine or feminine. And in that sense, language is very biasing. So if you use any words that describe, for example, an engineer, a musician, or other words, you have to use in terms of formal language, you have to use the masculine form or the feminine forms. Other forms are coming now, which we then refer to as neologisms, and these enables us to actually have a third option, and sometimes a third or fourth options. But actually, for the moment, because French speakers have been so used to the binary notion, it's even when we use those new neologisms. So, for example, you would say un ingénieur, une ingénieure, you would add an E as well, but this is also a neologism. But still, this is the masculine and feminine. And we can see now ingénieur, for example, A-I-R-E, which could mean different things. It could mean a non-binary individuals, but it could also mean either a male or a female individual. Or it could mean actually we don't want gender, we don't want to mention gender. So those three strategies in French have been haven't been studied very much, at least in psycholinguistics. But what we can see is that people still struggle to understand those forms as non-binary, most likely because people do struggle with the very notion of the non-binary. And in places like Switzerland, and I like to speak about Switzerland because I know Switzerland very well, Switzerland being very conservative and very, very right-wing country. Actually, it's the main party is extreme right party. It's even more difficult because actually the very notion of non-binary gender is actually not very well accepted in the majority of society. So in that sense, and it goes with what Julie says as well. It's like in a sense that the language and even non-binary neologism, actually, people still struggle to see them as non-binary because actually they struggle with the very notion of non-binary gender. So I think this is important to say as well.
Thank you, Dr. Pascal. And I think what I really like from that is that though there might be some resistance to it, there are still steps being taken to evolve a language to make an allowance for these non-binary or gender neutral terms, which shows that language is not stagnant, and like our politics, it can and does evolve. So I'd be really interested in hearing from the other panelists whether that and how that evolution is occurring in your linguistic cultures. Maybe we can start with Jean-Claire, who is writing about that progress, about that evolution and the strides towards inclusive language in Spanish. Jean-Claire, can you tell us a little bit about, what the context was and what progress is looking like?
Yes, so, well, Spanish is most Romantic languages are very similar to French, in which, well, for example, a group of people, even if it's like 10 girls and 1 boy, will be referred to as 11 boys because it is a very patriarchal, masculine language. And it's also a gendered language, whereas just like French, even inanimate objects have genders. So one of the claims that feminists have brought in terms of changing, making the Spanish language more inclusive, is the fact that due to Spanish being so patriarchal and everything, like the default being male, it perpetuates this idea that, men are superior to women. And this it's further explored in writing as well, literature, how when you are referring to a female character, you have to be more specific, or a group of female characters, you need to be more specific, because otherwise the assumption is the characters are male or a mixture of both. And then on the side of non-binary, the non-binary community or gender neutral community, there was a proposed pronoun, because once again, so far we only have masculine and feminine pronouns, él or ella, lo, la, los, las. So they did try to propose, for example, okay, so we have Latino and Latina, see? And then they tried to propose Latine or Latinx. That was declined because, well, it was brought into attention that adding that pronoun would essentially change the entire language. Not change, but because now we'd have to add that neutral pronoun to every part, every aspect of the Spanish language, which then brings a bit of a problem because the E pronoun exists in other aspects of the Spanish language. For example, when you say esto or this or that, that is also gendered. There's this masculine, este, this feminine, esta, and then there's this neutral, which is esto. So now there's that discourse where they're trying to figure out how to include gender neutral pronouns while also not changing the language too much. And that is a constant battle between the LGBT community, the feminist communities, as well as the Real Academia, the RAE, who are the decision makers in terms of Spanish language. And so far, not a lot of strides have been made, unfortunately. In terms of inclusivity, what I can say, what I've read about so far is that terms as gay, lesbian, transgender have been added to the Spanish dictionary and are official and not listed as a mental illness or anything like that. But in terms of pronouns, there is still progress to be made because so far we are still stuck on feminine and masculine only. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. I think that brings me to my next question, which is for Landa. And I'd like to know, Landa, based on your experience as an author, a researcher, what are different approaches to inclusivity when it comes to the formation of policies and, for example, in inclusive healthcare? Like, is there differences in the understanding when people talk about inclusive language or using inclusive language to define how to make a space more inclusive?
All right, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I think so far as the research that I've sort of done, in the primary healthcare space, because that's where it's located, there's quite a big gap in terms of language as a tool to center the patient in healthcare. I speak about the intersectional identity because when a patient is seeking care, they cannot be approached based on their surface anatomy. That's the argument I seek to make. And so in healthcare spaces, in primary healthcare spaces, there's a very big disconnect in terms of the language and tailoring of care, especially amongst the gender diverse demographic. At master's level, I explored the understandings of nurse practitioners, particularly in terms of trans and gender diverse related healthcare in the form of hormone therapies. And this research established that, firstly, sex and gender. Sex and gender was still used interchangeably. Firstly, so that's the first problem. And secondly, the reliance on the gendered pronouns was still reigning supreme, or is still reigning supreme. So in other words, the introduction of the broader sort of scope of gender neutral pronouns is seen as a somewhat of a thorn in the healthcare system side, because now you're expecting healthcare providers to start learning new language, which I don't understand, because I would like to think, in as much as I'm not a language specialist, but gender neutral pronouns are innate to a lot of languages, certainly in my language, which is isiXhosa. grammatically, isiXhosa is not gendered. So when we talk about they, them, that's actually how we speak in our native language. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. There's a lot of gaps at primary healthcare level, which I can assume filter all the way up to tertiary levels of care. And even from a visibility perspective, the sort of stationery in these healthcare spaces is not inclusive. Sort of in terms of the graphics used and also the language that is used, it's still very gendered and very sort of fixated on locating a patient based on their surface anatomy.
Landa, I think the healthcare sector is also an excellent place to explore how that failure to be inclusive can have practical effects and tangible harm on people who are seeking care, on people's even likelihood of seeking care. Have you, in your research, in the work that you've done, come across some of those practical effects and harms that the failure to be inclusive in language might lead to?
Yes, it's very violent. It's the initial experience of violence from a space that, thank you for your question, from a space where you are seeking or you're going to seek care. So it's a complete sort of negation of the intention of a user of any particular facility within the healthcare landscape. So there's discrimination, there's violence. So a lot of trans and gender diverse demographics, for example, would choose not to access these spaces because these spaces are the source of added psychosocial trauma on an already sort of extremely burdened identity that is being stripped and marginalized and being trying to be erased at any level in the spaces that they move in. So healthcare in and of itself many experiences have been documented. I have found sort of some of my research findings from the healthcare providers themselves. They've been explicit in their unwillingness to sort of provide inclusive care to people who do not know who they are or what they want, because it reduces the human being to a surface level in terms of their physical body. And that is how the heteronormative nature of this binary healthcare system that we have is stripping autonomy and personal agency from diverse human beings seeking care. So it's very brutal. It's taxing and weighs heavily on a lot of individuals who are trying to access this care. And some of them would actually choose not to access these facilities or go to these facilities because of the continued trauma they will experience in trying to assert themselves with the healthcare workers.
All right, thank you so much. I think that this has started to get us thinking about how there are different approaches to the way we view and perceive gendered constructions of identity in society. And I just wanted to follow up and ask, through your literature that you've been producing, I read your book, by the way, and it's very enlightening. Like, he really goes in depth and touches on the different challenges in the process of transitioning and specific challenges and how they were overcome. But I wanted to ask, have you found that people respond to your work based on the background that they come from? So let's say the language background that they come from. Like, I know your home language is very different to the English language in that it's more inclusive of speaking about people in gender neutral ways. But when you were coming out to people, how did that impact the way they perceived you based on their understanding of the language you had started to use?
Thank you for that question. It's actually a very brilliant question. And I think I also need to just put it out there that as human beings, we are not homogeneous, right? So we're not this monolithic block that's going to have linear experiences. In my experience, the language that I used, the language that I'd found at the age of 28, in terms of my immediate spaces, you know, my communal space, it was relatively unheard of, because I mean, I'd also struggled to find the language that speaks to my reality, firstly. So it was unheard of, firstly, but I think on the flip side of that, there was this willingness from these primary and communal spaces that I moved in. There was a willingness to allow the addition or the enhancement of the lexicon of the spaces to add this transgender identity, being a transgender man. I also always talk about, so this research of mine, I talk about this intersectional identity, which borrows from Kimberly Cranshaw's framework of intersectionality, looking at the various struggles that we carry on different levels in terms of our humanity. So an identity for me would then be incorporating of my lesbian part of the journey towards becoming him. Because at that time, there was no lexicon. I didn't know what was going on. I could not find a way to quantify this identity that needed to align on multiple levels. And so I think if we look at it from an intersectional perspective, so there's the racial element to me, there's the, you know, class elements, there's, you know, gender elements, sexuality, all of these elements that bring together this person that I'm becoming. And I think in my primary spaces, what catalyzed the journey for me in terms of this language and inclusion of this language, and the fact that I had a space to actually say, this is who I am, for the most part, was a byproduct of, you know, for lack of a better way of placing it, the construction of my home, and for a larger part of that, the preservation of a specific patriarchal image. So I always talk about my grandfather's image was quite something at the time. And because I think, this is just my analysis of it, because I think he was such an established patriarch, by the time I introduced myself, my community allowed me to shift within existing spaces because they had a particular way of viewing my grandfather's image. And so because I was his grandchild, they had to create space. That is how I unpack it and try and understand it, which for me then says I carried a somewhat of a privilege in being able to introduce this language into these primary spaces. So I think it becomes important then to look at, it's not linear, it's not black and white. It's important to look and explore at these intersecting elements that were at play that allowed me. So it's not the construction of the isiXhosa language per se and the fact that it's innately neutral. There are other forces and other elements that also worked with that to allow me to be able to introduce the identity and the language linked to it. I hope I'm making sense.
You definitely are. Thank you, Landa, for sharing that with us. And I think what you say shows us that as much as a lot of this conversation has been quite negative, the repressive and exclusive role that language often plays, queer people are and can take language and mold it and use it to affirm their identities and describe their experiences. And I think that is happening in pockets across the world in many different linguistic cultures as it is. And so I think a sort of last question before we open the discussion up to the floor is, what's next? So we know where we are right now. We've discussed history a little bit, but how do we move forward into a world where language and the societies that we're in are more inclusive, allow us to pursue liberation. And also, I think, as an important point, resist the sort of co-option of queer identity and queer terms by brands and institutions who don't necessarily have our best interests in heart. So ideas from the panelists, what's next? Where do we go from here? Perhaps Dr. Pascal, you might want to start.
Maybe I start by giving just one little addition to what has been said. I think the first thing to start with is the realization that actually the whatever steps we make now in language, they are firmly based on what I would call, and that other people have said, it's demasculinization. So whatever we do now, we need to get out of this male privilege, this man privilege. We need to, within language, but also within society. It's important to see this androcentric perspective that we've had through language, through many languages, but even through then stereotypes, through everything. For me, the main step is to realize that we are demasculinizing. I don't know how to say it in English, but still, this is the first step. This is once everybody agrees on that step, then we can have a very constructive discussion on what are the different options for that we can actually move towards. For me, it's very important that the fundamentals is that we need to demasculinize the society and language. And once we do that, well, we can get out of this androcentric perspective for nearly every single domain of our life. And we have to stop these men privilege, I think.
Perhaps we can pass to Zenshe.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that we should definitely move forward and keep advocating for more inclusivity, because after all, what isn't official does not exist. So even if people in the Romance languages can continue to address themselves or refer to themselves with gender neutral pronouns such as Latine or Eye, as long as they go onto Word and type that in and they get that red squiggle, they are still being ignored. And that's what we should be gearing towards, being inclusive and acknowledging that gender neutral pronouns and gender neutral people exist, and it should be part of the new norm.
All right. And although you're not officially on the panel, Julie, would you mind perhaps maybe sharing some of your thoughts on this?
Well, I spoke a lot already, but I can just add that I believe we have two lines to follow. And the first line for me is to be the people in the shoe, so keeping disturbing the order of gender and sexuality. But at the same time, it's exhausting. And we also need to live our lives. And so this is the two lines, I guess, finding a way to be comfortable in just expressing people, and at the same time, pushing the political queer agenda and feminist agenda to disturb, the order and our patriarchy.
All right. And then Landa, can you please share your thoughts as well? And then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
So thank you. Yes, I agree with Julie. It is definitely a double-edged sword, which is why it requires a multi-sectoral approach. I think in my experience, the civic society organizations the world over have been doing a great job. We also need academia to step up. We need to start having the conversations on the home level, because a lot of this fabric is weaved on the home level. That's where the language is determined for the most part. And then filters through to community and then to society. And that's what becomes a society. Interesting facts. Until the 1940s, the color pink was seen as a masculine color. So it was worn by boys. And the color blue was softer, and it was a girl's color. So what I'm trying to say to show about this, it takes an intentional approach by human beings at some other point in their lives to decide, this is what we're going to make the rule now. the social norm, and we're going to map it onto the whole of society. So we definitely need to continue the work on multiple levels with different approaches. And hopefully at some point we can get to a point where we can actually live our lives. But until we are actually safe enough to do that without possible violence being meted on us, we just have to continue doing the work.
I like that as a sort of end point. We just have to do the work, and we have to do it intentionally. So any questions from the floor, or comments, additions that you would like to make, stories you'd like to share? Yes, so I think we will repeat your comments or questions to the...
If you're comfortable with coming forward, you can come forward and I think speak, so that they can hear your panel first. So yes, we'll start with the person in the white jersey. Yes, the white and black striped jersey.
Healthcare rights of everyone about transgender people and just and how big is given to them in such a rate. So it's very interesting, right? In order for us to be able to transform the language and it puts it on the it allows for evolving of it's such an important and I heard that say again it's just that we need everything to put it together.
All right, just to briefly repeat the comment so that everyone online is able to be included. The comment was that it was a reflection on Landa's presentation, and the speaker is saying that considering how progressive South Africa's constitution is for providing formal recognition of LGBTIQ+ people as needing to be seen as equal, you would think that when it comes to healthcare rights, specifically for transgender persons, that there would be, there wouldn't be this disconnect between how people are able to access services based on the way they identify or the attitudes towards, this understanding of gender identity. And then the speaker also said that this evolution is very important, and we need academia to step up and do the job of, further exploring these ideas, because there is a major disconnect, and people need more opportunities to learn. So I think then we can go to here, and then we'll do Karina after. And then are there any other hands from the physical room at the moment? Okay, we see a fourth one, a fifth one, a sixth one. Okay, great. So we have lots of questions and comments. So yeah.
Before the hands, sorry, just to drop a note based on that comment. Our constitution is a great promissory note. It's good on paper. It's been studied at the world's best universities, but until it works for the population, it will remain just that, a promissory note, which is why we need people in that specific field as well to keep advancing, same in academia, same on the ground. Hence, I was speaking about a multi-sectoral approach to the preservation of human rights. Another thing, a lot of these healthcare workers have never been taught anything but a binary heteronormative way of treating patients. So that is why in some of the work that I do, in the research that I do, part of it is to advocate for an inclusive curriculum, because one of the reasons they will not be comfortable with rendering inclusive care is because, and I quote, it was never part of our curriculum. So there are structural barriers as well, hence the multisectoral approach.
I wanted the people on the screen to be able to see me, but you probably can't hear me now. If I speak loudly, yeah. I was thinking about Zintle's point, how the red squiggle is a form of policing your language, what you're allowed to say, but the computer says no or yes. And often, I don't know about you, but my computer always defaults to American English, and I have to every time choose South African. But could we not have an opportunity to choose queer English maybe as something to play with? But that isn't my main point. I was thinking about whether subcultures invent languages that offer liberation or maybe forms of concealment and subterfuge, which are simultaneously liberating but oppressive to other groups. I'm thinking in the time I grew up, which was a long time ago, it was kind of a sort of queer subcultural language, which was quite misogynistic, I think. And I'm thinking, as another example, more contemporary one, of sort of drag subcultures. RuPaul's Drag Race is an example where you get a sense that sometimes it can veer into misogyny. And I know RuPaul himself was called out on possible transphobia because of the show's initial rejection of trans women. And I think more recently they had a trans man who was feminine identified as a contestant. So whether certain spaces are both liberatory and oppressive at the same time.
Great, thank you. I think maybe for the interest of time, we will take our next question, and then, well, actually these are more comments, so that was a comment, so.
A good one.
Okay, yeah. So no specific. So that is one. Yeah, everyone can also benefit from my knowledge. All right. I actually wanted to firstly share a very nice quote I heard at another discussion, which was, queerness is that thing that lets us feel this world is not enough. And I think in the discussion of languages, we can also see that it's not enough. The fact of being queer sometimes is that the world is not catered for us. And on that note, I wanted to ask a question from the community, because we often speak about agendas, speak about protests, pride, and where do we then find our freedom as a community? Because we are just people. We are just people. I think one of the panelists touched on this. We're just people trying to, oh, sorry about that, trying to live our lives, just queer students trying to be a part of UP community in our own way. So where do you have advice for the youth perhaps about fighting this war, and where do we find our freedom? Okay. I think that's a great question. I think we'll move on with questions, but we'll make a note of them and then come back to them when we do responses from the panel. So we'd like to go to our next question. Yeah.
So my question and it's most on the idea of that I find that languages and daily things, and I'm kind of interested in finding out what role does academia or academics in that? Like the work of Intersectional Identity is already happening on culture spaces. Things, words, or phrases such as this, identify this as everyone, about something or whatever, you know. And I think that it, at here, there's a say, extend yourself further into recognizing the basis of knowledge, you know, that knowledge that actually is grassroots led. You know, I find that we have been speaking about earlier, like this gap, you know, but what is happening, then there's also like superiority complex in the space that makes people that are actually on the ground creating this actually works. Their work is not recognized on such platforms. And the other thing that I found interesting, I'm a social advocate, so product designer. So I'm always interested in how things take tools that can be more inclusive, but when it's using universal or local rights systems, etc., and just spoke about something interesting, like having an option to clear language. So yeah, do you think, to summarize my question, do you think that academics can play a role in extending knowledge or language that are based on and legitimizing them in their work? And also, what other ways do you think that digital technology can be used to have this?
Right. I think just to summarize, the speaker was commenting on the previous comment by Pierre on how languages are recreated in subcultures, and there are two specific questions: was what role can academia play, particularly in recognizing the efforts of people in informal spaces or at the grassroots level of creating and fine-tuning languages that work for identities such as LGBTIQ+ people. And then the second one is how can technological tools become more diverse? And then we'll move on to the next question. And that I think was from a person in a blue jacket. Would you?
My voice is loud enough. So firstly, I want to apologize for the most probably the least educated person. Language that I try to
I'll repeat what the speaker is saying just now.
I want to ask a question about most people don't feel all feelings.
Non-binary.
So I want to get us 20 years into the future, and the language has been built as a tool together. Is that person that I encounter, this is my question, having to have to encounter
themselves, yeah.
himself or herself every time I have a conversation? Is anybody thought about it? How will it play off 20 years into the future? The follow-up question is that one is the thing. Will it be up to the person to make that decision? I try to empathize. I say this again, if I hurt anybody with my experience, I apologize as well. I always think the only way I can reach there is if someone was a machine and they know that I'm not living in a machine. And I feel strongly about it. And I assume that non-binary person feels the same way. And I would like to know, is the non-binary person going to have an outcome?
Right. Yeah. So I think this question was a great one. It comes from a speaker who says that they are learning a lot during our session, and the specific question was imagining a world where understandings of being gender diverse is common. People have a wide range of understanding that you can meet people of different gender identities. However, they were asking every time a non-binary person discloses their pronouns in conversation or introduces themselves, is that a form of outing themselves? Like, are they, I'm assuming
Are
you
they
mean,
being forced to out
yeah,
themselves?
like are non-binary people continuously being forced out themselves when they speak about themselves in contexts where they're not sure how other people react to and respond to their identity? So just to like fly through the next range of questions. So I know you were number 5, so there was number 6 and then number 7, and then we'll close questions from the physical room. So sorry to give everyone numbers. So the person in, I think it's a navy blue top. Yes, you can go next.
I think when I first started learning I didn't have that, and also that the right hand is now I want the rest and I would think that some right the hand that I want to move. But I want to exchange that they together with all with us elsewhere. It's not how pronouns are used, but also because their slurs that could but it exists in the language where a man rubbish coming so I think even though it might yeah, but I think also that language assist in line with how society our language is shaped by us. So I think
All right, just to repeat it for the online audience, I think the speaker's comment really touched on what was said about how no language is less sexist than the other by Julie, and their question is kind of around the dominance in languages, which is very clearly sexed, and how like society has kind of used language as a tool to regulate other people's behavior, comment on things from a more heteronormative lens. And I think perhaps the question that comes from this is that can languages be assessed by people through other lenses, perhaps through a queer lens, a feminist lens, a human rights lens, in order to make it more functional? So that I think touches back on the idea proposed in the room of having like a queer dictionary, a queer language setting that you can revert to, so that like-minded people can then have common understandings, which is what I think, the community has informally done. And even today, we are still seeing that there is an evolution in how language is used, through activists who mobilize for the rights of LGBTIQ plus people. And then I'm going to go to my last in-house comment, and then we'll check online to see if there are any comments online. Okay.
power dynamics would be practice and language. And what is that? Probably. And then you would be small things. So way to love using prestige, but I think different cultures will say. And maybe I would say so that's the concern I think about
All right, thank you so much. So that was our last comment from the room, and I think the person really touched on the concept of verbal hygiene, which was introduced to us by Julie, and how access to justice is framed through an understanding of power dynamics and privilege, you know, and for different communities, such as this individual's experience as a person with disabilities. There is a linguistic prestige that you can use. And I think something that the speaker touched on is that when you have, when you're multilingual, you can have the privilege of using a language that is gender neutral when you're speaking about other people or speaking to people in spaces that may not be as queer friendly, or you're not sure yet while you're still feeling it out. And I think that kind of brings us, you know, to a point where we can have responses from the panel, but also I think reflecting on like how far we've come in this conversation this afternoon. I think, you know, we can understand that language is so diverse and broad in the way it impacts people's lived realities and experiences. And I think, you know, the queer community has shaped our context in many ways in terms of moving forward and creating its own linguistic subculture. So when it comes to various identities, the concept of someone being non-binary or gender diverse in some form is still fairly new in the modern world, although in other cultural backgrounds, people can confirm and say that, you know, first of all, it's not in the language, and second of all, like there are these historic references to people of different presentations, people who exhibited different behaviors. And I do think that there's a colonial impact in the way that archiving of our queer histories has taken place. So I will leave it to Sahela to find our panelists to respond to the questions. And I have them down if there's any specific ones.
Well, I think maybe to start with, do any of the panelists have any particular comments they want to make on some of the questions that were raised, something that spoke to you and that you'd like to comment on?
Okay, I see Sakhilem has raised their hand. Sakhilem, are you able to unmute?
Yes, I am.
All right, you can go ahead. We're going to try to spotlight your video, but in the time being, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you so much. Apologies to the rest of the panels and apologies to Dr. Julie. I completely missed the whole interaction today. Rural living has been very unkind to me. I've been driving from one spot to the next, trying to get connection. But as most South Africans would understand, with load shedding comes no internet connection at all. And I suppose for me, the frustration that I've sort of felt and I've carried with myself for today is exactly that, a frustration that is carried by a lot of queer persons in living in rural spaces. And, you know, I just said to myself, let me try again, because this is such an important topic and it's a topic that is very close to my heart. And I can already tell from some of the comments that I'm sort of picking up that, you know, we've touched on the very important key points for myself, which is the co-creation of meaning by social agents, which is us queer people in these spaces in which we find ourselves, and how we personalize language and how we take ownership of language. But one thing that I sort of wanted to also add on, I'm not sure if I'm being a broken record because I missed majority of our talk today, but it's the fact that language as a tool is also a medium in which we create a relationship with ourselves, because we think through language. We experience ourselves in relation to the world through language. And it is really about, are we speaking to ourselves in an affirmative way, and what does that mean? Do I have, for instance, as a Black queer from KwaZulu-Natal, in the repertoire of my language, in the repertoire of the terms that are available to me, do I have a way of relating to myself that does not demean me or dehumanize my experiences as a queer person? And I see that we've sort of touched on this issue of queer dictionary or translations, and I'm not so sure how further along the lines did we unpack, you know, issues of loss of meaning when we do those translations. And of course, in terms of power, you know, who has access to the queerpedias that we work on and that we put out there? And do they really relate to the lived experience or the narratives that queer persons in their intersectionality find themselves? Being that is a queer person who has an abled body versus a queer person who perhaps has a disabled body. Do I have language that is non-binary? And if, as a trans person, what does it mean for me to be trans, and for us to use, you know, the term trans before relating to the visible body experience or the experienced gender of a person? So, you know, it's a lovely conversation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panelists have to say to some of the comments or the questions that were raised that I caught light of. So yeah, I wanted to be in just to apologize, and also to say I'm really going to be replaying this, and just because I can already tell it's been very lovely, and yeah, the unkindness of existence in the rural space. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakhilem, and thank you for those thoughts. I think though you weren't with us for long, you've definitely contributed to our understanding. It's about 2 minutes to 5. If it's all right with everyone, we'll take only 5 more minutes and then we'll wrap up and release you to the snacks. I think perhaps to sort of conclude, a lot of the comments we've had have related to what are the role of subcultures in creating language, as opposed to what is the role of academia or a dictionary or tech in recognizing language. And I think perhaps Zinhle and Dr. Pascal and maybe even Julie can comment on that. But I would just to throw in a question, say perhaps you could comment on whether we would even want academia or tech to play that role. To what extent is that assimilationist? How much do we trust academia as like an institution and a holder of power to be an arbiter over our experiences and the work that subcultures, grassroots movements, and people are doing in the language space?
Well, I would say I'm really bad about prescriptions, and so I wouldn't feel at the best place for speaking about dictionary or building tools. So I think, well, it will emerge, and that's fine. But no, I'm not comfortable as a linguist or for this kind of aspect. So I don't know if Pascal or Zinle or Sakhilem have those views on that.
Can I just join Julie exactly in what she was saying? As academics, we mostly observe what happens, and then we describe or whatever, we theorize about it. But the one thing interesting about this dictionary and grammarians and prescriptives and languages, the case of they, the singular they. The singular they disappeared at the end of the 19th century because some grammarians thought the masculine he was better than the singular they, and it disappeared. The singular they disappeared for a century, and it came back at the end of the 90s, and it came back, and now it's actually firmly there. But actually nobody said that it should be there. Nobody said that it should come back. It's just usage. It's just people use it. And what Julie said about you need a big community that repeats the same words and repeats it, and then the word just is there. It's there's nobody has to say that it's there. The dictionaries, they're just reactive. They're just, if it's enough in the usage, then the dictionary is put in the dictionary. So yell, for example, the non-binary pronoun is now in the dictionary, in the Robert and the online version, and it has only a limited definition in it. But still, if we carry on using those forms, it's okay. Then it's usage, it's people, it's us, it's you, it's everybody. It's not the grammarians, not the academics. We have nothing to say about it, and it's definitely not those official places. They have nothing to say, and usually they have no specialists anyway. So yeah, it's people and usage. So if you want to invent a word and you find enough people that find this word really great, then this word will actually become part of language. It's not a problem, and it's already language anyway.
And sorry, I'm just reading the comment of Sakhilem in the chat, and well, I think it's not contradictory. Sakhilem is saying, for me, for me, academia needs to acknowledge the inherent power dynamics inherent in the position that it holds and take lead from queer lived experiences and local knowledges of queer persons. And I think maybe academia could be a tool, it could be used, but it's not the place where it should start from in any case. And so I think it's a political struggle in any case. So maybe academia is not it's too institutionalized to be a place for making proposition. I don't know. It could help. It could be a place somehow, but well.
And Zinhe, do you want to contribute to that?
Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Well, I'll contribute as a learner of a language on the role of academia. So while a language is built on by the people who speak it, the natives, academia plays a very important role to learners of the language. So while the natives the native speakers can decide on this word and this way of speaking, as external people, as learners, we have to rely on academia to learn these languages. So there has to be collaboration, as Sakhilem said, collaboration is key. Because if the native speakers are saying this and academia is saying that, everyone who's learning the language is more likely to go towards academia, which just clashes and there's no agreement. So we need both, actually.
No, that's perfect. And I think that's a good place to round off, which is to say that institutions definitely have an important role to play in recognizing language, to an extent, maybe even legitimizing language, but ultimately change happens and is done by people like us. So I guess this is an open invite to everyone to go and make that change, and to ensure that the silence that Julie spoke about in her keynote address does not persist, that queer people are not rendered invisible, and that we do continue to speak up. Thank you everyone for being here, for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who contributed to making today happen, whether it be financially or by volunteering and lending your assistance. We are so glad to have hosted you and so grateful to the panelists and to our speaker for all their excellent thoughts and perspectives today. And now we invite you all to enjoy the food, to travel home safe, and to keep doing the really excellent work that we're sure you're all doing. Right.
So there is also an exhibition on display outside that you're welcome to take a look at and ask questions about. Will be on site. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to have you.